excited to give this 4-part class, because in the past I've usually been limited to a 45-minute talk or an hour talk, and early this year gave the class that was 2.5 hours, which was wonderful. But there's so much here to share, and we want to really expand our consciousness and become aware of these new developments, which are really ancient developments from thousands of years ago, since these ancient civilizations, which we'll find out more about, talked about the importance of this 24,000 precessional cycle and how the 4 ages were based on it. Whether you look at Plato or the Mayans or the Egyptians, or in Peru, the Incas, you go all over and you find they all had this precessional cycle that was so important to them, and we should find out why, because we have a lot to learn that we've forgotten. So I'm going to actually start with a little video of this is from the great year that Walter Cruttenden had developed, narrated by James Earl Jones. And Walter Cruttenden is really the one who started this whole awareness of the great year, or the Yugas, back around, I think it was 2002 or 2003 was the first CPAC conference that he put on. And I myself have been involved in studying the Yugas since the late 1960s, really got into it in the early 70s, and Brother Dharmananda, one of the monks at Self-Realization Fellowship, I spent a lot of time with him. He gave me a lot of information. He's passed away now, and now Brother Achalananda, who is actually now Vice President of SRF, he's the other one that I know that still has a lot of that knowledge. And they were both engineers at Hughes Aircraft before they became monks, and so Brother Dharmananda is the one that helped me a lot on this, and so a lot of the information that's really found nowhere, it's like he gave to me, and so I've kind of developed this over the years, but I always thought, well, I'll write a book about it someday. And then Walter came along with CPAC, the Conference on Precession and Ancient Knowledge, and then he developed this DVD, and to give people a kind of an overview. And this is like about 45 minutes, but what we're going to do, we're going to only watch about 9 minutes of it, because if you see it in motion, how the precession cycle works, it kind of clarifies things and makes it easier than for me to go in and get into detail. So let's start with that. And also Walter wrote a book called Lost Star of Myth and Time, which is a wonderful book, kind of the first big book, on the Yugas. And then Joseph Selby and Vyasa Steinmetz, and Ananda came out with this book a couple of years ago, and this is a wonderful, wonderful book, really well done. And so let's start with this, so you kind of get an introduction.
Could it be that our sun is in a binary orbit, creating a 24,000-year cycle that affects the rise and fall of civilization? Many ancient cultures seemed to think so, and now some modern-day scientists agree. If true, there should be evidence of advanced civilizations older than the 5,000 or 6,000 years we find in most of today's textbooks. One of the most obvious astronomical cycles is the occurrence of the spring and fall equinoxes, the 2 days of the year where day and night are exactly equal in length. Ancient calendars were set by these consistent markers, which are still used today to calibrate universal time. And ancient star watchers faithfully observed the celestial movements and patterns in the sky. A key observation was that certain constellations follow the same path in the sky as the sun. Each year, on the day of the equinox, when they made their observations, ancient astronomers realized that over time the constellations were not in the exact place in the sky that they had been the year before. The stars seemed to be moving backwards across the sky, a movement known as the precession of the equinox. When he wrote his paper explaining the solar system, Copernicus observed three motions of the Earth. The first motion is the Earth's daily spin on its axis. The second motion is the Earth's annual trek around the Sun. But he needed a third motion to explain precession. He used the term wobble or libration, assuming that only a wobbling Earth could cause us to see a different part of the constellations each year. Over 100 years later, Sir Isaac Newton applied his theories of gravity to the idea of a wobbling Earth. He determined that the Sun and Moon were the only things big enough and near enough to cause the wobble. This explanation of precession is known as the lunisolar theory. Another factor that might contribute to the wobble is the shape of the Earth. This is the predominant theory among astronomers today. But in 1749, French astronomer Jean Léron d'Alembert found that Newton's lunisolar equations did not quite work, so he added variables for torque and inertia. Still today, lunisolar precession formulas continue to be adjusted, and some say they don't reflect physical reality. The seasons are caused by the tilted Earth revolving around the Sun. Any change in the tilt of the Earth, whether due to a massive meteor impact or the subtle wobble of lunisolar theory, would result in a change of seasons, even though our calendar would stay the same. Lunisolar precession theorists reconcile the regularity of our seasons by requiring the equinox to occur before the Earth completes its full 360-degree orbit around the Sun. But this solution contradicts lunar equations and observed eclipse cycles. Each answer merely creates a new question. Could there be an easier explanation of precession? Ancient scholars who observed precession of the equinox provided a simpler explanation than a wobbling Earth. They said that our Sun curves through space, moving in a great orbit of its own, pulling the Earth and other planets along with it. If the Earth did move along with the Sun on a curved path through space, we might see the same precession of the equinox through the zodiac and changing of the pole stars that the lunisolar wobble theory now attempts to explain. But it would not be caused by the Earth's wobbling independent of the Sun. It would be caused by the whole solar system curving through space. Another reference frame. A partner star to our own Sun? Some say the binary model confirms all of our celestial observations without the need for excessive torque or epicycle-type explanations. While the concept of a second Sun challenges our present understanding of the solar system, it is hardly a new idea. Some of the earliest astronomical records refer to the existence of dual suns. In fact, Mithraic beliefs were based on this concept. As we look deeper into the universe and expand our knowledge of its motion, we've come to realize that single suns are more the exception than the rule. With so many binaries in the heavens, why wouldn't our Sun have a partner? Then again, if it did, wouldn't we be able to see it by now, with our high-tech observatories or the Hubble Space Telescope? While there might not be a visible companion, it doesn't mean one's not there. Some stars can't be seen at all, such as black holes or old neutron stars, and others, like brown dwarfs, are barely detectable. Also, the long orbit period of 24,000 years would make the connection of our Sun to a binary partner extremely difficult to detect. One sign we'd expect to see would be the changes in the Sun's rate of movement. In a binary system, orbital speed is not constant, and theorists say it would cause changes in the precession rate. If the current rate of speed were constant, a complete binary cycle would take almost 26,000 years. But scientists have confirmed that the rate of precession is increasing. In a binary system, this would mean that two stars are moving closer together, and the cycle would take much less than 26,000 years. The cycle of a binary system might also be observed in the geological record. Mathematician Milutin Milankovitch noticed the Earth has had global warming and cooling cycles that roughly correlate to the length of the Great Year. Just as the binary model answers questions of the past, it could also be applied to solve scientific questions of the present. For example, at the edge of our solar system is a field of asteroids known as the Kuiper Belt. In 2001, a team of scientists from the University of Michigan made a startling discovery. The asteroids appear to end very abruptly. A sheer edge like this would be expected in a binary system. Also, a large number of long-cycle comets in our solar system come from a very small part of the sky. Although some astronomers like John Matisse and Daniel Whitmire think it may result from the gravitational pull of an unconfirmed 10th planet, our sun's binary could also have this effect. Another enigma. All celestial bodies have angular momentum, a force that corresponds to their mass and motion. Yet in our solar system, angular momentum is unevenly distributed. The sun has 99.9% of the total mass, but only 1% of the total angular momentum. If we acknowledge that our sun is curving through space in a 24,000-year binary orbit, we find the sun's angular momentum was there all the time, but primarily in its orbital motion, not just in its spin. Although the possibility of a binary star agrees with many observed facts, it does raise questions. The most common objection is, if we were in a binary system, we would know it by now. But we may be looking for something that is very far away and very hard to see. New discoveries in astronomy and archaeology are adding more and more to our understanding of the true depth of our own history. If we continue these pursuits, perhaps we will prove the link between binary motion, precession, and man's place in the great year. History reveals that ancient cultures around the globe were aware of a great cycle that connected the movements of the heavens and life on earth. The great year tracked not only time, but perhaps, we will find, the very rise and fall of civilization itself.
Just to add a couple of things, I started in Self-Realization Fellowship in 1964 when I was 16, and I was really searching and just found, I had this amazing experience, and I knew I'd found my path. And then I was studying physics, and then got interested in history of religions, and I did my bachelor's in philosophy, my master's in Asian studies, and my doctoral work in the history of religions, and then also it's really interesting. I mean, I also went into engineering and worked at McDonnell Douglas and then Northrop Grumman Aerospace for some 30 years and 35 years or so, and so I've always worked right between, kept up with history of religions and philosophy and science and engineering, and it's interesting because all these years of studying the Yugas, that covers both those, So I feel like I've prepared my whole life kind of to be studying the Yugas and still using both fields, both sides, and which has been really wonderful. Now that I retired, I have more time, and so I'm hoping to get this book done soon on the Yugas, and because I have most of the material together. But then again, you're always discovering new things, always finding new things. I'll be sharing some of that in these 4 classes So the overall overview here, we look at what Plato called the great year, or what we call the Yugas in India, and we'll look at India's keys to the Yugas. We'll look at some of these qualities that is hidden in India's wisdom that reflects the Yugas, which is, I find fascinating. And we'll look at like Indian philosophy and Patanjali's Eightfold Yogic Path and the Four Root Cosmic Illusions, and how all these tie in with the Yugas. And then we're going to apply the Yugas to history and go around an entire 24,000 year cycle. And you'll be amazed at how accurate this whole cycle is, at what's happening, and we'll see how we got here and then where we're going in the next thousands of years up to the next golden age, and then we'll go from the last golden age upwards to kind of to where we are. And because I didn't want to start at the high point because it sounds too far out, but if we start more in our time period of recorded history and then work towards our time and then forward and then back through the higher ages, then it all kind of makes more sense. And so to start with, I always love to quote Plato from the Timaeus, and Plato lived 427 to 347 BCE, before the Common Era, or before Christ. And here he's recounting Solon's visit to Egypt, and Solon was an Athenian statesman, lawmaker, and poet. And it's interesting because he's talking about what happened. These Egyptian priests are telling what happened thousands of years ago. Their records, at that time in 500 BC, when Solon was alive, the Egyptian priests still knew all this stuff. It hadn't been destroyed yet, like the Library of Alexander wasn't destroyed, and all these kind of ancient records. They may have forgotten some things, but the priesthood had kept things up until that time. And so a very old Egyptian priest said to Solon, "Oh, Solon, Solon, you Greeks are all children, and there's no such thing as an old Greek." "What do you mean by that?" inquired Solon. "You are all young in mind," came the reply. "You have no belief rooted in old tradition, and no knowledge hoary with age. And the reason is this: there have been and will be many different calamities to destroy mankind, and the greatest of them by fire and water, lesser ones by countless other means. This is the reason why our traditions here are the oldest preserved. But in our temples we have preserved from earliest times a written record of any great or splendid achievement. Whereas with you and others, writing and the other necessities of civilization have only just been developed when the periodic scourge of the deluge descends and spares none but the unlettered and the uncultured, so that you have to begin again like children in complete ignorance of what happened in our part of the world or in yours in early times. You remember only one deluge, though there have been many, and you do not know that the finest and best race of men, the Atlanteans, that ever existed lived in your country. You and your fellow citizens are descended from the few survivors that remain. The age of our institutions is given in our sacred records as 8,000 years. That's 500 BC when he's saying this. And the citizens whose laws and whose finest achievements I will now briefly describe to you, therefore, lived 9,000 years ago. So that was like 9,500 years prior to that, like BCE, So that's a long time ago. And I just love this quote, that was on Plato's Timaeus. And then Walter Crutton, who I mentioned, founding the CPAC, the Conference on Precession and Ancient Knowledge, back around 2003. I spoke there a couple of times, first time in 2006. And he said, like a patient with amnesia, mankind has forgotten his past, making it almost impossible to plan for the future, because the past, all these things have been laid out of what this cycle is about and what will happen, from now in the next 3,000 years is actually already somewhat clear because of what we know from the past. And it's interesting because now archaeoastronomy is finally a recognized field. And archaeoastronomy meaning the astronomical knowledge of the ancients, of the ancient civilizations. And before, even as strange as it may seem, it was ignored. They knew, like when I was studying at UCLA back in the 1960s and 70s, they were teaching that, sure, some of these old texts mention that, like for instance, the Taittiriya Samhita, one of the Vedic texts, it places the Pleiades at the winter solstice. So if you look up in the software that we've now developed, and you find out very simple, you go in that software, astronomical software, and you put the Pleiades in the winter solstice, where does that put you? Well, that would put you around 8,500 BC. So the people writing that text were saying, this is what happened, this is where we were when it happened in the precessional cycle. Now why would they ignore that? They would, that's just all, made up. And some of the astronomical data places the Vedas before 10,000 BC. And the reason that they ignored that is because back when a lot of these texts were translated in the early 1900s, people still followed Bishop Ussher saying that the world was created, going through the Old Testament, he determined that the world was created, 4,500 BC or something like that. I remember, now I should know that date, I've seen it 1,000 times, but anyway, they said, okay, that's when the world was created, and everybody in Western civilization basically accepted it, and all these scholars, they took it for granted that the world was only like 6,000 years old, which is mind-boggling to us, even when we had all the geological data was coming in that this doesn't make sense. But they still stayed with it because scholars tend to stay with what they learn, and so they said, well, okay, obviously the Vedas are pretty old, so okay, let's say they're like 1,000 BC, that's being generous or whatever, ignoring these actual texts where it actually tells you this is what we were doing when this constellation was at the equinox, at the vernal or autumnal equinox, which is a very precise time. And all the ancients used that method of keeping time, which we have not been doing, and because it's new to us. And so what's interesting, the satellite images of the dried up Sarasvati River, when the satellite goes over India and they scanned that and they found, there's the Sarasvati River, the dried up riverbed. They found it, okay? But we knew that the river, that by 3000 BC, the river only flowed seasonally and dried up completely in 1900 BC. Well, if the Vedic people speak of the Sarasvati River as a mighty river, and they do all over the place in the Vedas, then you've got to do some corrections here and find out that we were wrong. We've got this all wrong. And remember about Indus Valley civilization, Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro? That's all dated around 1000 to 1500 BC or so. That obviously took place after the Vedic civilization, which comes way before then. And it's the exact opposite of what we've been taught in school all these years. So bit by bit we look at the astronomical data, because now we're taking archaeoastronomy seriously as a field. And one of my friends that was supposed to be here tonight, she hasn't shown up, but she's actually studying archaeoastronomy, and she actually studied with this one man who helped decipher the Mayan hieroglyphs up in Canada, and he recently passed away. She was her only student at the end, and he was in his 80s. And so it's exciting that archaeoastronomy has become a field taken seriously finally. And so we're going to see a lot of changes in the history books. And one of the other things that was so amazing is Hamlet's Mill. Walter first made me aware of this, but Hamlet's Mill, an essay investigating the origins of human knowledge and its transmission through myth. This book was written in 1969, and all of us involved in the Yugas, we've all been studying this book because it's so important. Giorgio de Santayana was the professor of history of science at MIT. So this is not some fly-by-night person, professor of science, history of science at MIT. And then Hertha Foundation from Europe, they co-authored this book, and they found that over 30 ancient civilizations all focused on the precession cycle as central to their culture and humanity. Now that means something. Why did they leave all these clues? Now the book is very difficult to read. It's really thick book, a lot of data, and it was pretty well ignored because it was difficult to read. And not only that, but as they themselves had said, when they grew up studying mythology and ancient history, they were trained to ignore astronomical data because that's not part of their field, so they just ignored it. And finally, the two of them said, well, wait a minute, this is central to the text. You can't just ignore this. You have to look at this. And so pretty soon they found, oh yeah, this is all talking about the precession of the equinox and how it affects civilization and about the ages of man. And so it's time to put this in perspective and take it seriously. So bit by bit, all this is happening. And so, as we already saw in the video a little bit, the spin of the Earth produces a day, the orbit of the moon around the Earth, we have the month. The annual orbit of the Earth around the sun produces the year. But what does the sun do moving through the galaxy? The sun moves at 220 kilometers per second, or it covers 4.7 billion miles per year and circles our galaxy in 250 million years. The sun is about 5 billion years old, and it has circled the galaxy about 20 times. So the sun could be said to be 20 years old. And what I want to say is that usually we talk about how the Earth revolves around the sun and it comes back to the same position. No, it doesn't, because by the time it's come back over here to that position, the sun has moved 4.7 billion miles. Like the distance from the Earth to the sun is around 93 million miles. That's nothing compared to 4.7 billion miles. So that distance of, like, say 93 million, say 100 million, that's 1/10 of a billion, and if you multiply that by almost 5 times, that's the distance. In 1 year, the sun is here, the Earth, moving around. We're starting down here. After 1 year, come back, it's way, 4.7 billion miles from where it was before. And this type of stuff we've been ignoring, in astronomy a lot, this kind of fact. And that's not the only motion. We think that it's going around the galaxy. We're finding out, since some 80% of all stars have binaries, our sun has this other path at the same time. And so that's what's kind of confusing. It's very complicated in multivariable calculus and all this stuff to calculate all these different trajectories. And so when you're saying that, well, is Sirius our binary, which a lot of the ancient civilizations say it is? Well, we to plot all this stuff and to know what the actual trajectory is pretty complicated for us at this point. And my dear friend John Daring, who has spoken about the subject before, who's a physicist, he actually has a experiment planned out with lasers. If the lasers are placed at far distances across the Earth, you could actually calculate and show that we have this extra trajectory that would prove the precessional cycle as being a binary cycle. So that's kind of exciting, but you have to have funding for these things. I'll be talking about a project that I have in mind that would prove the Yugas conclusively, but I have to find funding. So that we'll get into that later. So the Western calendar based on the birth of Jesus, Hebrew calendar based on Genesis, Islamic calendar based on the Hijra, when Muhammad went from Medina off to other place. Where?
Mecca.
Yeah, right. Thank you. Yeah, and then then there's the new Hindu calendar, which is, they're all linear except for the old Hindu calendar. That one is cyclical. So we count on our years based on the birth date of these revered personages, but is there a scientific calendar that we can use, which incidentally the ancients used, which is the precessional cycle? And so right now we're still using all these linear calendars, and because the Western world with the technology kind of took over, we're accepting the birth of Jesus as the basis of the calendar that we're using now. But the Yuga cycle, I'll get into that in a little bit later, but there are two calendars in India, but they still have the old cyclical calendar, but they made a mistake, and we'll get into that later. So just to see what it looks like, and I can't use this down, this disappears at an angle, so I'll look over here, so you have this 24,000 year cycle, and we're actually right around here, and we've, our history going backwards in time, recorded history where we really know stuff is really in the last, we call it a Bronze Age or Dvapara Yuga, but it's not the Bronze Age that they talk about, and the Iron Age they talk about in geology and in history. It's a little different. This is the four ages that Plato talks about, and all the other ancient civilizations talk about. So we call the Bronze Age the Dvapara Yuga in India, and the Treta Yuga is the Silver Age, Satya Yuga is the Golden Age, and so they have these different time lengths of time, and so you can see that this low age here is actually pretty short in comparison to this. This is like 17,000 years in length, and this is only like 7,000 years. It's not that. So unfortunately we're in this lower age, which is our bad luck, so to say. But this is the good. These are the good years here. And so the cycle of the ages is like the seasons of the year. You have the 4 seasons, and it's also interesting that you have the 24 hours in a day, 12 like 24,000 years here, 24 hours in a day. This is like a clock, and we have 12,000 years descending age, 12,000 years ascending, just like we have with our 12 hours, and 12-hour clock, and we have daytime and nighttime, and the whole thing, I don't know, it's hard to trace where this goes back to Babylonian times, or where did the 24-hour clock come from. It seems like it's based on this, but can't prove that. So So the time to the ancients was told by observing the constellations of the zodiac. And now we get to the holy science by Swami Sri Yukteswar. It was because of Sri Yukteswar that we received the clarification about the yugas. So a lot of people just took things for granted in terms of the longer yuga cycle. That's a different cycle than the one we're going to be talking about. And and Sri Yukteswar, for the first time, clarified the proper length of the yugas and their link to history. And so he reconnected the yuga cycle with the underlying celestial motion of the precessional cycle, which had gotten lost. And because that's the important cycle, because the other cycles where they say that, like Kali Yuga, the Dark Age, lasts 432,000 years, how does that fit into history? Whereas our precessional cycle is 24,000 years. Here we can see what happened, like the Greeks, were down back in here, like the Egyptian civilization, and all these civilizations ended around this time when Kali Yuga started. There's a reason for that, because of this cycle. And Taramata, one of the disciples of Yogananda, did a lot of work on the yugas and wrote those articles in the old magazines that is now available on the web. You can look that up, and they're fascinating to read, very insightful. And so we talked about precession a little bit, the slow backward movement of the equinox against the background of the constellation of the zodiac. So the binary star explanation, rather than the wobble of the Earth, it's actually the the binary movement of the two going around each other that's causing precessional cycle. And so the equinoxes are the one day each year in spring and fall, when day and night are approximately equal length. And so over this period of 24 to 26,000 years, and the idea Sri Yukteswar said it was 24,000, because if you're in an elliptical orbit, the speed changes as the way the sun moves through that binary orbit, and so the average turns out to be 24,000 years. That's what Sri Yukteswar says, and that's what we'll find, because we already found, and you mentioned it here, the scientists today have noticed that the precessional rate is speeding up, which doesn't make sense to them, but if you look at it in terms of a binary cycle, it does make sense. Newton didn't know any better. He thought that the precessional cycle was the wobble of the Earth. That was a good guess, But when you find out that if we look at the precessional cycle of Mars, we're going to find out that the same as ours, then we'll know that the precession is not the wobble, And the every year the meteor shower that comes around September or so, that meteor shower comes the same time every year and on the same day. That should have changed over the centuries if precession were the wobble of the Earth. What's also interesting is, and I mentioned this last time earlier this year, the precession, as you're going around each year, like the ancient, like say Stonehenge, you have the like a hole or something lined up so that the sun is exactly at that point. Each it comes around on that day, on the vernal equinox or the autumnal equinox. And when it hits there, you'll notice that each year that constellation is backed up by what was it? Was it 1 degree? Every 72 years, it's 1 degree. It loses 1 degree in 72 years. So it's backed off, going the opposite direction. So instead of going forward, you're going this way. And you notice it's a little bit behind. And so if you imagine yourself without our modern technology, without our modern telescopes and all this precision that we have, you imagine you're back in ancient Egypt, and you know, your father is the astronomer, and he's telling you, okay, I've watched this, you know, this is now, I'm 72 years old, and, you know, I've been watching, well, I mean, he'd have to be like in his 80s, because he would have just been born, you know, he'd be telling his son, look, now I'm like 85 years old or so, and when my father showed me, you know, there's the star, do you think his son, he would have noticed with his son that, okay, where I saw that constellation 72 years ago, it only moved 1 degree. I mean, you know, 360 degrees of a circle. You figure 1 degree, you know, are you going to notice that? Say, hey, it's moved a degree. Does that mean that in 24,000 years it goes 360 degrees? Who's going to, I mean, no one's going to notice that. But they did. All these ancient civilizations, and Hamlet's Mill, he mentioned over 30 ancient civilizations, over 30. That's most of the great civilizations anywhere on the earth. They all knew precession, that it was this precessional cycle. I mean, it kind of blows my mind that they would have that kind of insight. So they knew stuff. They were capable of doing things that we would not expect, because that takes a long time to see that, like 72 years to see 1 degree of movement. You know, who's going to figure that out? But they all did. You know, so to me, that's amazing. So what causes this change? What?
They didn't live that long.
Right, yeah, and you think, you know, like a lot of people in the, well, like in the Dark Ages, nobody knew these things, and then most of the length of life wasn't that long, you know, and you're right, you know, and...
well, the Yugas were known, I mean, this cycle was known many, many years before the Dark Ages, right?
What?
This whole cycle was known many, many years before the Dark Ages.
Exactly, because in the Dark Ages it was forgotten. Nobody knew it in the Dark Ages.
When did it first come into understanding?
Well, the further you go back, the more they knew. Just like in Egypt, the Great Pyramids weren't. You'd think they were built at the end of their development, but no, the Great Pyramids were built at the very beginning of Egyptian history. Where did that come from? Now we know better, because now we've heard about Göbekli Tepe in around 10,000 BC. That's been proven by the German archaeologist working over there. He found in Turkey, he found all those ancient structures, and look up Göbekli Tepe. I'll talk about it more later, but you know, nobody thought there was, where was the infrastructure for these great pyramids to be built? It seemed like they thought nothing was there before. Well, if you got Göbekli Tepe at around 10,000 BC, which was actually buried later, intentionally buried, which is very strange. You know, what were they trying to protect? And you know, but so the further you go back, the more we seem to know. You know, and we just lost all knowledge right during that period of the Dark Ages. So like Sri Yukteswar said, the sun has another motion by which it revolves around a grand center called the seat of the creative power, Brahma, the universal magnetism. This creative power regulates dharma, the mental virtue of the internal world. So if you think that some universal magnetism can't affect our abilities to think, then like here's like a scientific news just recently where scientists were applying transcranial magnetic stimulation to the left anterior temporal lobe of the brain, allowing for temporary exceptional counting and calculating abilities similar to those of autistic savants, according to scientists at the Australian National University. And you know, other people have done these experiments, and they've been amazing how effective these different frequencies are on the brain. So, and Sri Yukteswar is saying that there is a center out there, which we called, like I think I have it in this next slide, the Vishnu Nabi, or like the center where all this power comes from that affects us. And as we're rotating around the binary, let's say here is the Pleiades, because all ancient civilization talk about the Pleiades as being the special power center from which this higher awareness comes. That's God's way of bringing the energy into this galaxy or whatever, or into this portion of the galaxy. And what's interesting is, like, you've heard of the book of Job, which is the oldest book of the Old Testament. God is telling Job, canst thou bind the sweet influences of the Pleiades? And what he's saying is, can you bind the sweet influences? Can you hold your planet in the golden age where it's under the sweet influence of the Pleiades? No, you can't, because I'm God. I ordained that there would be cycles, and that you can't control these things, but I do. Can you bind the sweet influences of the Pleiades? So that's in the Old Testament, which I think is fascinating. And but this grand center, it's about 430 light years away, has something special. And as we are going, like here's like, if this is the Pleiades, and Alcyone is the special star that seems to have some kind of special emanation. And so as we're rotating around our binary, we get closer and further away through our elliptical cycle from the Pleiades. And this sounds really strange, but think about it. If all these ancient civilizations talk about this being real, and that the Pleiades is the star that, or the Alcyone and the Pleiades is the star that's causing that influence, we should kind of listen to them, because there's something going on here. And especially when we go through this whole cycle, and I show you how history is so accurate, incredibly accurate, following this cycle, and over 30 of these civilizations all believed this. There's something to this, because they weren't even connected. These are the people in the Americas and Asia and Europe. They all had this knowledge. Where did that come from, right? And so, and even Yogananda and the Wine of the Mystic, I happen to find it in there in this one verse on page 146. He says, the Pleiades contain Alcyone, the star that the ancients considered to be the central pivot of the universe. Interesting, so even Yogananda would mention that. So anyway, they call that the galactic center, or the Vishnu Nabi. And now it could be, my friend John Daring was saying, he had studied tornadoes, and he said that tornadoes have vortices inside them. And the vortices are the ones that do the damage. And they're, I think, always odd number of vortices. And those are the ones that cause the damage in the tornado. And in the same way in our galaxy, we could have different vortices. And one of the ones that's affecting us, nearest us, is the Pleiades. In terms of allowing that, what's the word for it, type of vortex energy to pour out and influence us. And so we found that Professor Valerie Hunt at UCLA, I think she's retired now, but she did a lot of effects of ambient electromagnetic fields on test subjects, which was really remarkable. And this kind of work was kind of doubtful a few decades ago, but now it's a real field in science. It's been recognized because it really has effects, like people that were put into a Faraday cage where they're shut off from the electromagnetic field of the Earth. People feel very, very uncomfortable. very and other people have had like get close to nervous breakdowns and things like this field is very important and so enhancing it causes euphoria and then there's people like they studied like these are very small, they call it extremely low frequency or ELF effects that affect us very deeply. And so like 100 thousandths of a Gauss cause this effect. And the solar system has complex plasma structure which acts like an antenna that enhances the effects from space from these different frequencies coming from the different stars. This, like the Earth resonance fields and things. Then one person, Mike Toppin, had used voltage multiplier effects on plants, and I've seen the pictures of like one set of plants growing like a whole rows and rows of plants growing normally, and then over here all with the voltage multipliers, affecting the plants. These plants were like unbelievable in compared to these, So it makes quite an effect. And so we're saying that these things are not haphazard, they really do something. And I think I talk about this somewhere else too, but I could probably mention right here. I had an interesting experience when I was in college. I was using this one technique to raise the energy upward through the spine to the brain, to take to strengthen the brain, and I was practicing that every day. And after a few months, I started to get this feeling of this glowing effect in my brain that just ongoing constantly. And I felt this radiance. And it was so strong that it felt like I had to stretch my feet to touch the ground. I was so uplifted all the time. And then, because at that time, it was a very wonderful time for me spiritually, I was meditating a lot of hours every day, completely effortlessly, and it was just amazing. And I wasn't doing much studying because of it. And so then I had this exam in the history of civilizations, which was incredible. This was at Occidental College, and they had this incredible program where all the professors from all the different fields all took part in teaching the history of civilization program, and really remarkable course. And so they had this exam coming up, and I realized I had to cover like 6 big books for the exam the next day, which I hadn't even started, and might sound familiar to some of you, and I noticed that because I was so uplifted and all this energy was pouring into my brain, I was able to just flip through the books very quickly, like just glancing at the pages, and I completely comprehended everything. And like in an hour, I was done. And the next day, I took the exam, and I came up with a way of tying all the questions together into like a approach to history that was actually passed around to all the professors because they were so impressed by it. And I got an A+ in the class and in the exam, and then later on, this stuff kind of faded away. And we get these things that happen to us that, make us realize how powerful things, how blessed we are with these techniques, but the point I wanted to make is about these electromagnetic fields and things that affect the brain. Well, that's what happened to me. I used this energy, bringing it up into the brain to light up my brain, and it actually worked. I have an A to prove for it with just one day of studying, And so this whole concept of being influenced by these vibrations from other star systems. And we talk about astrology, how these vibrations affect us. Well, the Yugas is another aspect, a greater aspect than astrology, that's even more affecting us. And by telling you that story, because it happened to me, I can tell you, that this kind of stuff does work. And so, and the beauty of it is you can make it happen inside of yourself. You don't have to wait for the Yugas to come put you in a higher age. You can do it yourself through yoga, through your spiritual practice. And that's really one of the things to be learned from that. Why wait for the Yugas to get born in a better age? You can create your own portable paradise inside, right? So now I wanted to mention, since all these ancient civilizations also mention Sirius as the binary, we should kind of take that seriously, that we still, with our science and everything, we have to prove this ourselves, because it's a little difficult to prove that Sirius is our binary. We're not at that point yet. We don't know. There are things in effect, like I think Don was mentioning some things about the vortex fields and things that we're just getting started on in science and physics. There's been work done in Russia and other places, and so who knows? You're saying the gravitational effect is such that how could Sirius be a binary star? But because it seems like it's too far away, but maybe because of these vortex fields, there's something going on that we don't understand yet. And but what's interesting is that Sirius remains about the same distance from the equinoxes and the solstices throughout these many centuries, despite precession. And one of the astronomers, I think that Walter had hired, maybe it was them that explained it, but if you're on a merry-go-round and then if Sirius is on the other side, then you're on the same page. All this other stuff is precessing, but you and your binary are not. So it's something like that, and so that's an interesting observation. This is made by Jed Buchwald at Caltech, so it's something pretty real, and anyway, so it looks like very probable that Sirius would be that star. And so some Indian texts from the Dark Ages think that the 4 ages are the same length of time. In fact, some of in the Kali Yuga, like the Surya Siddhanta and Aryabhata, I think the astronomer, some of them actually thought that the 4 ages were the same length of time. But if you understand that we're in an elliptical orbit in a binary system, then you realize that you have these long ages and then the short ages when the smaller part of the ellipse, So that's why you would know if we're in an ellipse, you have to have different times for the different ages.